This week we've been reflecting on the Sabbath, and we've looked already at Sabbath in creation. The very first thing we learn about the Sabbath is God creating the Sabbath. And we contemplated the concept that it wasn't just a day that God rested, that God didn't need to rest. Instead, God was actively creating the Sabbath for us, for a purpose. And so the rest of this week we've been looking at that purpose, and we've explored the dimensions of Sabbath as dependence on God, that it's a reminder that we need God, and when we slow down and we don't work for a day, that we recognize how much we depend on others. We've explored the dimensions of rest in Sabbath, that this rhythm of sleeping every single night and then resting once a week from our work is a way of kind of almost being like a metaphor for us living into a relationship of trust and rest in God as His creatures. And then we explored the concept of time, that there's something about God in time and Sabbath that we don't tend to focus on. And we looked a little bit at Abraham Heschel's book, Sabbath, and what he says about time and the Sabbath, and how it makes us aware of the element of creation that is time. We're so aware of the spatial element, but we're often ignorant of the time element. And then we looked at the fact that God created the Sabbath for relationship, that God showed up in the garden even after Adam and Eve had sinned. And so God was pursuing a relationship with us even in our rebellion, even as we were hiding from God. And what a great picture of the incarnation, that Jesus came in the flesh, that the Son of God became human so that God might pursue a relationship with us. And Sabbath is about us having that relationship with God, that dynamic of meeting with God and communing with God and having a day that we remember God's presence in our life in a special way. And so now we're at the end of the week. Now we're on Saturday, and this is the day that the Jews celebrated Sabbath for many years, and there's some Christians who still celebrate Sabbath on Saturday, but a lot of Christians have moved the celebration of Sabbath to Sunday. It doesn't really matter when you take a Sabbath. I don't think there's a legalism to this idea. I think the concept is for you to slow down, for you to take a day away from your labors, for you to take a day where you're connecting with God and being more intentional in your relationship with God and your trust of God, reminding yourself of your dependence on God and on others for everything. So it doesn't really matter which day you pick. It could be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever day you can afford to set this day aside for Sabbath. Would you be willing to consider that? Make a commitment this week to begin to practice Sabbath in some way in your life, to use this moment of being stuck in our homes. Well, I'm not stuck in my home today. It's a very nice day outside, so I've gone outside. But we're kind of isolated, and we're supposed to be staying in our homes as much as possible, except for occasionally going out for a walk or walking the dogs, and we're supposed to stay away from people. But we're taking this time where we are intentionally more slow with our lives and redeveloping our perspective to maybe build a habit out of this of Sabbath that can last for years and years to come. What say you? Will you join me in committing more fully to the concept of Sabbath and allowing yourself to recognize your dependence, allowing yourself to rest in God, allowing yourself to understand God's creative purposes in Sabbath, and allowing yourself to relate to God's goodness to you? Will you do that this next week and the weeks to come, even after we get things back to normal? Next week, we're going to be looking at the concept of waiting. We're all going to be sitting around and waiting for some time here, and so I thought it might be appropriate for us to consider the biblical principle of waiting and what God says about waiting on God throughout the Scriptures. We'll see you next week.